valves. They have elastic fibers in them so that when they are tensed, they get tight and close the airway. You push air out, it makes them vibrate, and that's what creates sound. The opening between the true vocal cords is the glottis. That's why this is epiglottis, it's above the glottis. So here is the anterior view, thyroid and cricoid cartilage, a little bit of epiglottis at the top. This is just a partial sagittal section. So here it shows a side view of the cricoid cartilage, how it's shorter in front, taller in back. Here's just a piece of thyroid cartilage. There's the epiglottis, and we can see a little bit of the vocal apparatus here. Now these pictures are looking down in, this with the glottis closed and this with it open. So the pink are the false vocal cords, the softer folds, and these two in gray are the true vocal cords. Questions on the larynx? Trachea. It's about 2.5 centimeters in diameter and 12.5 centimeters long. For those still working on being able to think in metric, that's about 1 inch in diameter and 5 inches long. Like the outer part of the nose, a lot of the pharynx was lined with stratified squamous to deal with friction from food. When we get to the trachea, we're back to pseudostratified epithelium. The wall is supported by incomplete rings of hyaline cartilage. They're C-shaped, open in the back because just posterior to the larynx is, or to the trachea, is the esophagus. When you swallow, the esophagus bulges out. This allows it to kind of push into the trachea a little bit as your bolus of food goes down, instead of having to make the whole thing stick out. But they go around far enough to make sure the trachea stays open. Questions on trachea? Okay. The bronchial tree is formed of 2 types of tubes, bronchi and bronchioles. The bronchi are the larger ones. Like the trachea, they're also supported by hyaline cartilage, but it goes all the way around. And in a lot of places, rather than rings, it's plates that almost interlock, just to hold the shape of the tubes. The bronchioles, anytime we add something to a word like old, yule, or even cold, it means little version of whatever the first part of the word is. The bronchioles don't have the cartilage. Instead, they have smooth muscle in their walls. So they can dilate and constrict the way arterioles can, and change the resistance in the tubes. So we had vasodilation, vasoconstriction, that alter peripheral resistance, and therefore blood pressure. The harder the blood has to push to get through, the higher the pressure. Airway resistance affects how quickly the air can get out to the gas exchange areas. You want low resistance, so bronchodilation when you want more air coming through. But when you don't need as much oxygen, then you want higher resistance, bronchoconstriction, which will also increase the surface area so that more of the air coming through hits the walls and gets particles trapped out of it. Bronchioles are up to 1 millimeter in diameter. A lot of them are actually microscopic. There are 3 sizes of bronchi. Names change mostly at branch points. So there's one trachea. Comes down, splits into two primary bronchi. Singular would be bronchus. This marker is running out. So primary is first. There's one for each lung. So you have a left primary bronchus and a right primary bronchus. They split into secondary or lobar bronchi, which means each branch goes to one lobe of the lung. The left lung has 2 lobes, the right lung has 3, so it's a little different. What you get is first one splits off, I'll put 2ND for secondary, and then the primary bronchus goes a little further before you get the other 2 secondary bronchi. And then tertiary bronchi, also called segmental, so within the lobes, which are structures you can actually see from the outside of the lungs, where each lobe ends and the next one begins. Bronchopulmonary segments are areas within a lobe where they all come from the same starting bronchus. There are 8 segments in the left lung, 10 in the right. So that's the number of tertiary bronchi as well. Here we see larynx, trachea, and bronchi, and then it stops before we get into bronchioles. So right here would be the end of the trachea. Left is easy to see. There's the primary bronchus, and then secondary after that. Right, it's a little less obvious. Here's a secondary, and there's the other 2 secondary. And then everything after that is tertiary.
Is there a reason why there's 3 on the right?
Yes, the right lung's a little bit bigger because what is in the center but a little bit off to the left? The heart. Bronchioles also come in 3 types. The first ones, branching off of tertiary bronchi, are intralobular bronchioles. A lobule is a section where you have some more branching bronchioles and then you get to gas exchange areas. So that should say 1 per lobule, not 1 per lobe. Primary bronchi is 1 per lobe, or secondary bronchi is 1 per lobe. And intra means within. Those branch out into terminal bronchioles, of which there are a lot. Terminal bronchioles are the last ones that don't directly connect to gas exchange areas. So terminal, like the end of the basic airways. After that, we start seeing some air sacs in respiratory bronchioles. These little bulges are the first gas exchange areas that the air will get to. The air sacs are alveoli. Single is alveolus. This little guy here would be an alveolus. Respiratory bronchioles branch into, and I'm going to enlarge for simplicity, alveolar ducts. Which again have alveoli on the side, but each alveolar duct leads to one cluster called an alveolar sac. And then in addition to being attached to respiratory bronchioles and alveolar ducts, there are alveoli attached to the alveolar sacs. So you've got kind of a central chamber and then a bunch of outer balls, and they all have little connections so the air can get through. So here's, every little ball is an alveolus. They're often described as clusters of grapes, but the difference with grapes is you have one little spike going to each one instead of them being lumped together in a central blob. So it's kind of more like a blackberry or a raspberry, thinking about this as empty. So that's the alveolar sac. This is the alveolar duct. And then the tubes it comes off of are the respiratory bronchioles. Questions on the structures in the bronchial tree? All right, you need a break before we continue? All right, so the lungs are the bronchial tree and the alveoli held together by connective tissue. Each lung has a hilum, which is where the primary bronchus, pulmonary artery, and two pulmonary veins connect. So they all come in right there together, and they branch out together. Pleura is the serous membrane covering each lung. If you remember your serous membranes, they all have two layers. Visceral, that's right up against the organ, and parietal, that's against the wall. And then they are touching with just a little bit of fluid in between. Rough view of the lobes of the lungs. So in the right you've got 3, left you've got 2, superior and inferior. And we've got to get really technical to name the third one. That's the middle lobe. We've already discussed why the left lung is smaller. Now, the inferior lobes look really tiny from the front, but these fissures that divide them actually angle up towards the back. So if you looked from behind, the superior lobes would look the smallest. Here's a more careful illustration of 3 lobes on the right with 2 fissures, 2 lobes on the left, 1 fissure. So any questions on lung structure? Our first clinical application is on smoking. There's like 4 clinical applications in this chapter. I've only included 2. So, the first thing that smoking does to the respiratory system is paralyze the cilia. So that means the mucus is trapped and you have to cough to get it out. That causes an increased risk of infection because the trapped bacteria stay longer. Over time, this can lead to chronic bronchitis, which is long-term inflammation of the airways. Another result, often from smoking but can come from other causes, is emphysema. There are 2 main features of emphysema. One of them is mentioned here, the other one we're going to come back to later with the other clinical application. This is loss of alveolar surface area. So some of these walls would be breaking down, and you have fewer big sacs instead of a whole bunch of little ones. That means